The cowboy waited for a bride by mail order, but identical twins stepped off the wagon. James McAllister stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun dip below the Montana horizon. The sky burned orange and purple, painting the endless grasslands in colors that would have taken his breath away if he had not seen this same sight 1,000 times before. 3 years had passed since he first claimed this land, 3 winters of bone-chilling cold, 3 springs of back-breaking labor, 3 summers of blazing heat that cracked the earth beneath his boots. He had built everything with his own 2 hands: the sturdy log cabin with its stone fireplace, the barn that housed his cattle and horses, the fences that stretched across his 200 acres of Montana territory. At 32 years old, James had accomplished what many men only dreamed of. He owned land, good land, with a creek that never ran dry and grass that grew thick enough to support a growing herd of cattle. His neighbors, scattered though they were across the vast landscape, respected him as a hard worker and an honest man. The general store owner in town extended him credit without hesitation. The banker nodded approvingly when James made his deposits. By all measures, James McAllister was a successful man, a man with a future, a man who had carved out a life in this untamed country. But success, James had learned, could feel hollow when there was no one to share it with. The loneliness crept up on him slowly at first. During those first months, he had been too busy to notice. There were trees to fell, logs to shape, walls to raise. Every muscle in his body ached by nightfall, and he collapsed into sleep with barely enough energy to eat the simple meals he prepared over his campfire. The work consumed him completely, leaving no room for other thoughts. As the cabin took shape and the ranch became more established, the silence grew louder. He would sit at his small wooden table, eating his dinner of beans and cornbread, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. Sometimes he would talk to his horse, a patient mare named Bella, just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. He wrote letters to his brother back in Ohio, but responses took months to arrive, and when they did, they spoke of a life that felt increasingly distant and unreal. The turning point came during his second winter. A blizzard had trapped him inside the cabin for 5 days straight. The wind screamed like a living thing, and snow piled so high against the door that he had to dig his way out to reach the barn and tend to his animals. Those 5 days stretched endlessly. He read the same 3 books he owned over and over. He whittled pieces of wood into shapeless objects. He stared at the flames in the fireplace and felt the weight of isolation pressing down on his chest like a physical thing. When the storm finally broke and he rode into town for supplies, he noticed something he had overlooked before. The other ranchers came to town with their wives. The shopkeeper's spouse helped run the store, chatting warmly with customers. Even old Pete Harrison, who lived on a struggling patch of land 20 miles north, had a wife who came to town with him, her face weathered but smiling as she selected fabric for a new dress. James watched these couples with a growing ache in his chest. He wanted what they had. Not just companionship, but partnership. Someone to build a life with. Someone to share the victories and weather the hardships. The idea came to him gradually, almost shamefully at first. Mail-order brides were common enough on the frontier, but James had always harbored romantic notions about love. He had imagined meeting a woman naturally, courting her properly, falling in love the way people did in the novels his mother used to read. But out here, where women were scarce and opportunities even scarcer, such romantic notions seemed like foolish luxuries. He wrestled with the decision for weeks. Pride held him back. What would people think? That he could not find a wife on his own? That he had to order one like a piece of merchandise from a catalog? But practicality won out over pride. This was the frontier, and frontier life required practical solutions. One cold February morning, James sat down at his table with paper, pen, and ink. His hands, rough and calloused from ranch work, felt clumsy holding the delicate pen. He started several letters, crumpling each one and tossing it into the fire before finally producing something he deemed acceptable. He described his ranch honestly, neither exaggerating his success nor downplaying his accomplishments. He wrote about the land, the cattle, the cabin he had built. He mentioned his age, his background, his hopes for the future. He tried to convey the kind of man he was. Steady, hard-working, honest, but also lonely and hoping to find someone to share his life. He sent the letter to a matrimonial agency in Boston that he had read about in a newspaper. Then he waited. 6 weeks passed before the response arrived. The postmaster in town handed him the thick envelope with a knowing smile, and James felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. He tucked the letter inside his coat and rode home before opening it, wanting privacy for whatever he might find inside. The agency had sent him profiles of 3 women seeking husbands out west. James read through each one carefully, trying to imagine what these women might be like based on the brief descriptions and small photographic portraits. The first woman was a widow with 4 children, looking for security and a father for her family. The second was a woman of 45, practical and experienced in farm life, seeking companionship in her later years. The third was Miss Sarah Crawford, 26 years old, a schoolteacher's daughter from Massachusetts. Something about Sarah's letter spoke to him. She wrote with elegant penmanship about her love of books and learning, about her desire to see the West and experience life beyond the narrow confines of Boston society. She had been working as a governess for a wealthy family, she explained, but yearned for something more meaningful. She was not afraid of hard work, she assured him, and found the idea of frontier life exciting rather than frightening. She included a photograph showing a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. James wrote back to her that very evening. Thus began a correspondence that would span 4 months and transform both their lives. With each exchange of letters, James felt he was getting to know Sarah Crawford in a way that felt both intimate and safe. She wrote about her childhood, her education, her dreams and fears. He shared stories about ranch life, about the beauty and harshness of Montana, about his own hopes for the future. Her letters arrived like treasures, and he would read them multiple times, memorizing passages that particularly moved him. Sarah's writing revealed a woman of intelligence and sensitivity. She quoted poetry and discussed books he had never read. She asked thoughtful questions about his work and seemed genuinely interested in the details of frontier life. She had a gentle humor that made him smile, and a thoughtfulness that suggested depth of character. Through these letters, James found himself falling in love with her words, her mind, her spirit. After 4 months of correspondence, James gathered his courage and proposed marriage through the mail. He waited anxiously for her response, checking with the postmaster more frequently than usual. When her acceptance arrived, he felt a joy he had not experienced since arriving in Montana. Sarah Crawford would come west to be his bride. The practical arrangements took several more weeks. James sent money for her train ticket and travel expenses. They agreed on a date for her arrival. He cleaned his cabin from top to bottom, made repairs to everything that needed fixing, and even built a small addition to give them more living space. Bedding, curtains, and dishes. He wanted everything to be perfect for her arrival. As the date approached, James found himself both excited and terrified. What if she did not like him in person? What if he disappointed her? What if the reality of ranch life was too harsh for someone raised in the genteel society of Boston? He had been honest in his letters, but words on paper could not fully convey the isolation, the hard work, the primitive conditions. The morning of her arrival, James rose before dawn. He dressed in his best clothes, a clean shirt, his newer pants, his good boots. He shaved carefully, trimmed his hair, and even splashed on some cologne he had purchased specifically for the occasion. He rode to town hours early, too nervous to wait at the ranch. The train would arrive at noon, and then a wagon would bring passengers the final 12 miles to the small settlement where James waited. He purchased a bouquet of wildflowers from a woman who sold them outside the general store. He rehearsed what he would say, practicing his greeting over and over in his mind. "Miss Crawford, I'm so pleased to finally meet you." No, that sounded too formal. "Sarah, welcome to Montana." Better, but perhaps too familiar. "Miss Sarah, I hope your journey was not too difficult." The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. James paced the wooden sidewalk, checked his pocket watch every few minutes, and tried to calm his racing heart. Other townspeople noticed his nervous energy and smiled knowingly. Everyone knew that James McAllister was meeting his mail-order bride today. Several people wished him well. A few made jokes that he tried to laugh at politely. Finally, in the distance, he heard the rumble of wagon wheels and the sound of horses. His heart began to pound so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He clutched the wildflowers tighter, feeling the stems bend in his sweaty palms. The wagon appeared at the end of the main street, slowly making its way through the dusty thoroughfare. James stepped forward, positioning himself where the wagon would stop. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This was it. This was the moment that would change his life forever. In seconds, he would meet the woman he had been corresponding with for months, the woman who had agreed to marry him, the woman who would share his life and his home. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the general store. The driver, old Mr. Patterson, nodded to James with a strange expression on his face, something between amusement and sympathy. James barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the wagon bed, where he could see a figure in traveling clothes beginning to stand, and then his world turned upside down. 2 women climbed down from the wagon. 2 identical young women with the same auburn hair, the same green eyes, the same delicate features. Both wore traveling clothes covered in dust from the journey. Both carried worn carpet bags. Both looked at him with expressions of surprise and confusion. James stood frozen, his mouth hanging open, the wildflowers drooping forgotten in his hand. He looked from one woman to the other, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. They were identical, perfectly identical, like mirror images of each other. The first woman stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. McAllister?" Her voice was soft, cultured, with the accent of the East Coast. "I'm Sarah Crawford." Before James could find his voice, before his stunned brain could process what was happening, the second woman spoke. "No," she said firmly, her voice slightly deeper but equally refined. "I'm Sarah Crawford." The three of them stood in the dusty street, creating a tableau so strange that passers-by stopped to stare. James felt as though his mind had simply stopped working. He looked at one woman, then at the other, then back again, searching for some difference that would tell him which was the Sarah he had been writing to for months. But they were absolutely identical. Same height, same build, same face, same everything. Even their expressions of confusion and distress mirrored each other perfectly. "I don't understand," James finally managed to say, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "There must be some mistake." The first woman, the one who had spoken initially, set down her carpetbag and clasped her hands in front of her. "Mr. McAllister, I assure you there has been no mistake on my part. I am Sarah Crawford. I have been corresponding with you for the past 4 months. I have your letters in my bag if you need proof." The second woman's eyes widened in shock. "That's impossible. I'm the one who has been writing to you. I have your letters as well." She turned to look at her identical companion, and James saw recognition dawn on her face, followed immediately by a look of horror. "Susan? What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here? What are you doing here, Sarah?" The first woman shot back, her composed demeanor cracking. "You're supposed to be staying with Aunt Margaret, and you were supposedly staying with the Hendersons as a governess." James watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. "Wait," he interrupted, holding up his hand. "You two know each other?" Both women turned to him simultaneously, and in that moment, speaking almost in unison, they said, "She's my sister, my twin sister." A crowd had gathered now, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding in front of the general store. Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife, stood on the wooden sidewalk with her hand over her mouth. 3 cowboys from a nearby ranch leaned against a hitching post, watching with undisguised interest. Even the town's children had stopped their games to observe the strange confrontation. James felt heat rising in his face. This was not how he had imagined this moment. He had pictured a private, tender meeting with his intended bride, not a public spectacle with 2 identical women claiming to be that bride. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some sense of control over the situation. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private," he suggested, gesturing toward the hotel across the street. "Ladies, if you would allow me to escort you inside, we can sort this matter out properly." The twins looked at each other, and James saw something pass between them. Some silent communication that only people who shared that kind of bond could manage. They both nodded, picked up their bags, and followed him across the street. The crowd watched them go, and James knew that by nightfall everyone within 50 miles would be talking about this bizarre situation. Inside the hotel's small sitting room, James secured a private corner while the twins settled into chairs across from him. Now in the better light indoors, he could see tiny differences between them. One had a small freckle near her left ear that the other lacked. One's hair was parted slightly differently. But these were such minor distinctions that anyone would be hard-pressed to tell them apart at first glance. "Perhaps," James began carefully, "we should start with introductions. Proper ones." The woman on the left spoke first. "I am Sarah Elizabeth Crawford. I was born 26 years ago in Boston, Massachusetts. I am the elder by 17 minutes. She paused, glancing at her sister. "I've been working as a governess for the Henderson family for the past 3 years. Or rather, I was working for them until 6 months ago when I contacted the matrimonial agency about coming west." The woman on the right took a shaky breath before speaking. "I am Susan Margaret Crawford. Also 29-year-olds, obviously, and also from Boston. I was living with our Aunt Margaret until I also contacted the matrimonial agency 6 months ago." James leaned back in his chair, trying to process this information. "And you both wrote to me?" "Using the same name?" "We both use the name Sarah Crawford," Susan admitted, her face flushing with embarrassment. "It's our legal name. We're both named Sarah, though I've always gone by Susan to avoid confusion. Our mother thought it would be romantic to give us the same first name with different middle names." "But why would you both contact the same agency without knowing about each other?" James asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Sarah, the elder twin, straightened in her chair. "We haven't spoken to each other in over 2 years, Mr. McAllister." After our father died, circumstances forced us apart. I went to work for the Henderson family, and Susan was sent to live with our aunt. We lost touch. Our aunt kept my letters from reaching Sarah," Susan added bitterly. "I wrote to her dozens of times, but later I learned that Aunt Margaret was burning my letters. She said that Sarah had abandoned the family and didn't deserve to hear from me." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I thought Susan had forgotten about me. The Hendersons would only give me 1 day off each month, and when I tried to visit Aunt Margaret's house, I was told Susan didn't want to see me. I had no idea our aunt was lying to both of us." James felt his heart soften toward these women. Whatever confusion and chaos their arrival had caused, it was clear they were victims of unfortunate circumstances themselves. "Tell me more," he said gently. "Help me understand what happened." The story that emerged over the next hour was heartbreaking. The Crawford twins had grown up in a comfortable middle-class home in Boston. Their father had been a clerk at a shipping company, their mother a former schoolteacher. They had been inseparable as children, sharing everything, understanding each other in ways that other people could not comprehend. Their parents had encouraged their education, and both girls had grown up loving books, learning, and intellectual pursuits. Then, 3 years ago, their mother had died suddenly of pneumonia. Their father, devastated by the loss, had thrown himself into his work to cope with his grief. Less than a year later, he had suffered a heart attack at his desk and died instantly. At 23 years old, the twins found themselves orphaned and nearly penniless. Their father's small savings barely covered his funeral expenses. Their only living relative was their Aunt Margaret, their mother's older sister, a bitter widow who had never approved of her sister's marriage or the way the twins had been raised. She had reluctantly agreed to take in Susan, the younger twin, but insisted she could not afford to house both girls. Sarah had been forced to seek employment immediately. The Henderson family had hired Sarah as a governess for their 3 young children. The position came with room and board, but very little freedom. Mrs. Henderson was a demanding employer who expected Sarah to be available at all hours. Mr. Henderson largely ignored the governess, treating her as just another piece of furniture in his grand home. The children were spoiled and difficult. Sarah's tiny room in the attic was cold in winter and sweltering in summer. Meanwhile, Susan's life with Aunt Margaret was equally miserable. The old woman treated her niece like an unpaid servant, working her from dawn until late into the night with cooking, cleaning, and caring for her elderly employer. Aunt Margaret was cruel in small, constant ways, criticizing Susan's appearance, her intelligence, her worth. She reminded Susan daily that she was a burden, an unwanted mouth to feed, a disappointment to the family name. Both twins had endured their situations for 2 years, hoping things would improve, clinging to the hope that they might somehow reunite. But as time passed and their attempts to contact each other were systematically blocked by Aunt Margaret's interference, both women had begun to lose hope. "I felt like I was suffocating," Sarah admitted quietly. "I would lie awake at night in that tiny attic room, listening to the sounds of the city outside, and feel like the walls were closing in. I had no friends, no family, no future beyond caring for other people's children while my own life passed me by." Susan nodded in understanding. Aunt Margaret made it clear that I would never be allowed to marry while under her roof. She said she needed me to care for her in her old age, that it was my duty as her niece. I realized that if I stayed, I would spend the rest of my life trapped in that dark, joyless house, growing old and bitter just like her. "So you both decided to seek a different life out west," James said, beginning to understand. "I saw an advertisement for the matrimonial agency in a newspaper that Mrs. Henderson had discarded," Sarah explained. "At first I dismissed the idea as desperate and foolish, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like my only chance at freedom. I had no money to travel on my own, no prospects for marriage in Boston, no way to change my circumstances. I found the same advertisement in a magazine someone had left at the market," Susan continued. "I hid it under my mattress and looked at it every night for weeks before I finally worked up the courage to write to them. I knew Aunt Margaret would never allow it, so I had to be secretive. I wrote my letter during the few minutes I had alone each day and mailed it without her knowledge. Both twins had sent their applications to the agency, both using the name Sarah Crawford, both including the same photograph that had been taken of them together years earlier. In the photograph, they stood side by side, so similar that it was impossible to tell them apart. The agency, receiving 2 separate applications with the same name and photograph, had assumed it was a duplicate submission and had only forwarded one profile to potential suitors. That profile had reached James McAllister in Montana. "But which one of you was I writing to?" James asked, though he dreaded the answer. The twins exchanged glances, and Sarah spoke carefully. "Mr. McAllister, what were the dates on the letters you received? Do you remember when the correspondence began? James pulled out his worn wallet and extracted several folded letters he had kept with him, too precious to leave at home. He looked at the first one, noting the date. The first letter I received was dated March 15th. It arrived here in early April. Sarah pulled out a packet of letters from her own bag, bound with a ribbon. These are the letters you wrote to me. The first one is dated March 22nd, responding to my letter of March 15th. Susan's face went pale. She fumbled in her own carpetbag and pulled out her own bundle of letters. Her hands shook as she checked the dates. The first letter you wrote to me is dated April 3rd, responding to my letter of March 28th. The truth settled over them like a heavy blanket. James had been corresponding with both women, though not at the same time. His initial letters had gone to Sarah, the elder twin. But somewhere along the way, the agency must have received Susan's application as well, and seeing the same name and photograph had begun forwarding James's later letters to the younger twin instead. So we were both writing to you, Susan whispered, her voice breaking. You were receiving letters from both of us, but you thought you were only writing to one person. James felt his head spinning. He looked down at the letters in his hand, trying to remember specific passages, trying to determine which twin had written which words. Some letters had quoted poetry and discussed literature with sophisticated insight. Others had been more practical, discussing household management and medicine. He had assumed they all came from one woman with varied interests, but now he realized the truth. Two different women had been pouring their hearts out to him, and he had fallen in love with both of them without even knowing it. The letter where you wrote about reading Wordsworth by candlelight, James said slowly, looking at Sarah. That was you? She nodded, tears now streaming down her face. Yes. Poetry has always been my comfort. And the letter about treating childhood fevers with willow bark tea, he asked, turning to Susan. That was me, she confirmed, her own eyes red. I learned herbal remedies from watching the local doctor when he treated Aunt Margaret. James stood abruptly and walked to the window, needing space to think. Behind him he could hear the twins crying softly, and the sound tore at his heart. None of this was anyone's fault, not really. They were all victims of coincidence, of a bureaucratic mix-up, of circumstances beyond their control. But that did not make the situation any less impossible. He had promised to marry Sarah Crawford. He had made a commitment, given his word, sent money for travel expenses. But there were two Sarah Crawfords, and he could not marry them both. James turned back from the window to face the two women who sat before him, both with tears staining their cheeks, both looking lost and afraid. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Whatever decision he made in the coming days would change all three of their lives forever, and there seemed to be no path forward that would not cause someone pain. Ladies, he said softly, returning to his chair, I think we are all exhausted from the shock of this situation. Let me arrange rooms for both of you here at the hotel for tonight. We can discuss what to do tomorrow when our minds are clearer. Sarah wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. McAllister, I cannot afford a hotel room. I spent nearly everything I had on the journey here. As did I, Susan added quietly. I took what little money I had been able to hide from my aunt over the past 2 years. It was barely enough for the train ticket and meals along the way. James felt a surge of protectiveness toward both of them. Please do not worry about money. I will cover the expenses. It is the least I can do given this entire situation. He stood and moved toward the door. Wait here. I will speak with the hotel owner. Within the hour, James had secured 2 small but comfortable rooms for the twins. He also arranged for dinner to be brought to them, understanding that they would prefer privacy rather than facing the curious stares of other diners. As he was leaving to ride back to his ranch, Sarah called out to him from the top of the stairs, Mr. McAllister, I want you to know that I understand if you wish to simply send us both back east. This situation is not what you agreed to, and you have no obligation to either of us. James looked up at her, seeing the pride in her bearing despite her obvious distress. I gave my word, Miss Sarah. I do not know yet how to proceed, but I will not abandon either of you without ensuring you have somewhere safe to go. We will find a solution together. That night, James did not sleep. He sat in his cabin, staring at the fire, reading through all the letters again and again. He could now identify which passages came from Sarah and which from Susan. Sarah's letters were filled with literary references, philosophical musings, and a gentle romanticism. She wrote about seeing beauty in small things, about the importance of education and culture, about her dreams of teaching children in a frontier schoolhouse. Susan's letters were equally thoughtful but more grounded in practical matters, She wrote about herbal remedies and cooking techniques she had learned. She discussed the challenges of homesteading with an understanding that suggested she had researched the topic thoroughly. She asked intelligent questions about cattle ranching, crop rotation, and surviving harsh winters. Where Sarah dreamed of poetry and culture, Susan prepared herself mentally for the reality of frontier life. James realized with a sinking heart that he had come to care for both voices in those letters. He had fallen in love with Sarah's gentle soul and artistic spirit. He had also fallen in love with Susan's practical wisdom and quiet strength. The woman he thought he was meeting was actually a combination of two different people, and now he would have to choose between them or lose them both. Over the next 3 days, James spent time with both twins, though never alone with either of them. Mrs. Chen, his housekeeper, agreed to act as chaperone. She was a Chinese immigrant who had come to Montana with her late husband during the railroad construction years. After his death, she had stayed on, supporting herself through domestic work. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who missed nothing and spoke her mind plainly. "This is a strange situation, Mr. McAllister," she said on the first morning as they prepared to bring the twins out to see the ranch. "But those girls, they are good girls. I can see it in their eyes. They have had hard lives." James brought both Sarah and Susan to his ranch, wanting them to see what life here would actually be like. He showed them the cabin he had built, the barn, the fields where his cattle grazed. He explained the rhythms of ranch life, the hard work involved, the isolation they would face. Sarah walked through the cabin with wonder in her eyes, running her fingers along the rough-hewn logs, examining the simple furniture James had made himself. "It is like something from a storybook," she said softly. "A pioneer's cabin on the frontier. I never imagined anything so rustic could feel so full of possibility." Susan, meanwhile, examined everything with a practical eye. She checked the stove, opened the cupboards to see what supplies were stored there, looked out the windows to gauge the light for growing a kitchen garden. "The cabin is well built," she observed. "But you will need more storage for food supplies before winter, and those curtains should be replaced with something heavier to keep out the cold wind." Mrs. Chen watched both women carefully and later pulled James aside. "The one called Sarah, she has the soul of a poet. She sees the romance of this life. The one called Susan, she sees the reality. Both are needed to survive out here, Mr. McAllister. Poetry keeps the heart alive, but practicality keeps the body alive." As the days passed, the situation became more complicated rather than clearer. The twins, reunited after 2 years of forced separation, rediscovered their connection. They stayed up late in their hotel rooms talking about everything they had missed in each other's lives. They laughed together, cried together, and gradually healed some of the pain that their separation had caused. But this reunion created another problem. Neither twin wanted to compete with her sister for James's affection. Both had too much love for each other to engage in that kind of rivalry. "I will not fight Susan for your hand," Sarah told James one afternoon as they walked through the town. Mrs. Chen followed at a discreet distance, maintaining propriety. "She is my sister, my other half. I lost her once and only just found her again. I will not let a man, even a good man like yourself, come between us." Susan said almost the exact same thing later that day. "Whatever you decide, Mr. McAllister, please know that I will not compete with Sarah. If you choose her, I will be happy for you both. I will find my own way somehow." Their nobility and love for each other only made James's decision harder. He was not choosing between two strangers competing for his attention. He was choosing between two women who loved each other deeply and who both deserved happiness. The whole town knew about the situation by now, of course. In a small frontier community, secrets were impossible to keep. People had opinions, and they were not shy about sharing them. Some thought James should choose the elder twin since she had written first. Others thought he should choose the younger twin since her letters showed she was better prepared for ranch life. A few thought he should send both women back east and forget the whole mess. And a handful of romantics thought he should find a way to keep both sisters in Montana, though how that would work, nobody could quite explain. James felt the weight of all these opinions pressing on him. He lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine his future with Sarah, then trying to imagine his future with Susan. Both visions felt right in different ways. Both visions felt wrong because they meant losing the other sister. On the 5th day after the twins' arrival, Mrs. Chen invited all 3 of them to her small house on the edge of town for dinner. She served a Chinese meal that none of them had tasted before, and the novelty of it helped ease some of the tension. As they ate, Mrs. Chen told them her own story. "My husband and I came to this country with nothing but hope," she said, her accent thick but her English clear. "We worked on railroad, very hard work, dangerous work. Many men died. My husband survived railroad, but then he got sick with fever. He died 5 years ago." She paused, looking at each of them in turn. "I was alone in strange country. No family, no money, no husband. People said I should go back to China. But I stayed. I made new life. It was not life I planned, but it is good life." Sarah listened intently. "How did you find the courage to stay when everything seemed impossible?" Mrs. Chen smiled. "I did not find courage. Courage found me. When you have no choice, you discover you are stronger than you knew. Life gives us problems we think we cannot solve, but somehow we solve them anyway." Susan nodded slowly. "But what if there is no good solution? What if every choice leads to someone being hurt? Then you choose path that hurts least people," Mrs. Chen replied, "and you trust that time will heal wounds. Not all problems have happy endings like in storybooks, but most problems have endings we can live with if we are brave enough to accept them." That night, as James rode back to his ranch alone, Mrs. Chen's words echoed in his mind. He had been thinking about this situation as a problem that needed a perfect solution. But perhaps there was no perfect solution. Perhaps he simply needed to find a path forward that all three of them could live with. The next morning brought an unexpected development. James was in his barn feeding his horses when he heard a wagon approaching. He stepped outside to see Thomas Bennett, a neighboring rancher, pulling up to his property. Thomas was a widower in his late 30s, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself. His wife had died 2 years earlier in childbirth, along with their baby, and Thomas had been living alone on his ranch ever since. "Morning, James," Thomas called out, climbing down from his wagon. "I hope I am not intruding, but I heard about your situation in town, and I wondered if we might talk." James invited him inside and poured coffee for both of them. Thomas wrapped his hands around the warm cup and seemed to struggle with what he wanted to say. "I know it is not my place to involve myself in your personal affairs," Thomas began carefully, "but I have been thinking about something, and I wanted to speak with you before I acted on it." "Go on," James encouraged. "I have seen the Crawford twins in town these past few days. I met them briefly at the general store yesterday. The elder one, Sarah. She was looking at books on the shelf there. We spoke for a few minutes about literature. She mentioned she had been a governess back east and loved teaching." James felt a strange flutter in his chest, though he could not quite identify what it was. "Sarah does love books and learning," he confirmed. Thomas set down his coffee cup and looked James directly in the eye. "I know this will sound strange, perhaps even improper, but I would like your permission to call on Miss Sarah. To court her properly, I mean. If she is amenable, of course." James sat back in his chair, surprised by how the suggestion affected him. His first instinct was to feel possessive, to say no, to protect his claim. But then he forced himself to think more carefully about what Thomas was proposing. Thomas was a good man, honest and hard-working. He owned a successful ranch just 5 miles from James's property. He had been devoted to his late wife and had mourned her deeply. He was educated, thoughtful, and despite his grief, he still had kindness in his eyes. If Sarah were to marry Thomas, she would stay in Montana. She would be close to her sister. She would have a chance at happiness. "You understand that I have made no decision yet about which sister I might marry?" James asked carefully. "I have obligations to both of them given the confusion with the letters." "I understand," Thomas replied, "and I am not trying to solve your problem for you. I simply met Miss Sarah, and I felt something I have not felt since my wife died. A stirring of interest, of hope, perhaps. I thought I would be alone for the rest of my life, but speaking with her yesterday, I wondered if perhaps there might still be a future for me beyond grief." James studied the other man's face and saw sincerity there. "The decision is not mine to make," he said finally. "If you wish to call on Sarah, you should ask her directly. But I will say that if she accepts your attention, I would not object. You are a good man, Thomas Bennett." Thomas Bennett left James's ranch with a mixture of hope and nervousness visible on his weathered face. James watched him right away, and for the first time since the twins had arrived, he felt a small glimmer of possibility that this impossible situation might somehow work itself out. He did not yet know how, but the seed of an idea had been planted. That afternoon, James rode into town to check on the twins. He found them sitting in the hotel's small parlor, working on mending some of their travel-worn clothing. They looked up when he entered, and he could see the strain of uncertainty in both their faces. This limbo they were living in was taking its toll on everyone. "Ladies," James said, removing his hat, "I wonder if you might both join me for a walk. There is something I need to discuss with you." They agreed readily, perhaps grateful for any distraction from their worry. With Mrs. Chen once again serving as chaperone, they strolled down the main street of the small town. James explained about Thomas Bennett's visit that morning, carefully watching Sarah's reaction as he spoke. Mr. Bennett seems like a thoughtful man, Sarah said quietly. We spoke briefly yesterday about literature. He was very knowledgeable about poetry, which surprised me. I suppose I did not expect to find someone interested in such things out here on the frontier. Thomas was educated back east before he came to Montana, James explained. His wife was a schoolteacher. She encouraged learning and culture in their home. After she died, I think he buried himself in books as a way to cope with his grief. Susan looked at her sister with concern. How do you feel about him calling on you, Sarah? Sarah's cheeks colored slightly. I barely know the man, but I confess speaking with him yesterday was pleasant. He has kind eyes, sad eyes. There is a gentleness about him that I found appealing. She paused, then looked at James with worried eyes. But what about you, Mr. Matt McAllister? What about our situation? James took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I have been thinking about what is best for everyone involved. The truth is, I cannot choose between you and Susan without hurting someone deeply. You are both remarkable women, and through your letters I came to care for both of you, though I did not realize I was corresponding with two different people. So what are you saying? Susan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I am saying that perhaps we should not think of this as me choosing one of you, James replied carefully. Perhaps we should instead focus on finding happiness for all of us in whatever form that might take. If Thomas Bennett wishes to court Sarah, and if Sarah is open to his attention, then perhaps that is a path worth exploring. Sarah looked uncertain. But that would mean I came all this way for nothing. I would be accepting the courtship of a different man entirely. You came here seeking a new life, did you not? Mrs. Misery, Chen interjected gently. You came seeking freedom from difficult situation back east, seeking chance at happiness. Does it matter so much if that happiness comes from different man than you expected? The question hung in the air as they continued their walk. James could see Sarah wrestling with the idea, her expression thoughtful. She had spent months building up an image of what her life would be like with James McAllister. Now she was being asked to consider an entirely different future with a man she had barely met. Over the next 2 weeks, an unusual courtship began to unfold. Thomas Bennett called on Sarah 3 times, always proper and respectful, always chaperoned by either Mrs. Chen or James himself. He brought her books from his late wife's collection. They took walks and discussed literature, education, and their hopes for the future. Sarah was cautious at first, but gradually James could see her warming to Thomas's gentle attention. Meanwhile, James found himself spending more time with Susan. Without consciously planning it, he discovered that he was naturally drawn to her practical wisdom and quiet strength. When he mentioned problems he was facing on his ranch, Susan offered thoughtful suggestions. When he described his plans for expanding his herd, she asked intelligent questions that showed she had been paying attention to everything he had told her about ranching. One afternoon, Susan helped Mrs. Chen prepare a meal at James's cabin. He watched her work in his kitchen, moving with confidence and efficiency. She examined his pantry and made a list of supplies he needed. She reorganized his storage to make better use of the space. She prepared a stew that was the best meal James had eaten since leaving his mother's home back in Ohio. You have a gift for making a house feel like a home, James told her as they ate. Susan smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her whole face. I spent years cooking and managing a household for my aunt. I hated doing it for her because she was never satisfied, never grateful, but I actually enjoy the work itself. There is something satisfying about creating order out of chaos, about preparing food that nourishes people, about making a space comfortable and welcoming. Those are valuable skills out here, James said. Frontier life requires practical knowledge as much as it requires strength or courage. As they talked, James realized that his feelings for Susan were deepening into something real and genuine. This was not the romantic fantasy he had built up through letters. This was something more substantial, based on actual time spent together, on shared values and compatible temperaments. He found himself imagining what life would be like with Susan as his wife, and the image felt right, in a way that settled comfortably in his chest. But he held back from saying anything. Sarah and Thomas were still in the early stages of their courtship, and James did not want to pressure anyone into making decisions before they were ready. The situation was complicated enough without adding more confusion to the mix. Then, 3 weeks after the twins' arrival, disaster struck the community. A young family living 10 miles outside of town sent word that their children had fallen ill with diphtheria. The disease was terrifying on the frontier, where doctors were scarce and medical supplies limited. Within days, 3 more families reported cases. The disease was spreading rapidly, and panic began to grip the small community. The town's only doctor, old Dr. Morrison, was 70 years old and overwhelmed by the sudden outbreak. He put out a call for anyone with medical knowledge to help him care for the sick. Susan immediately volunteered, explaining that she had learned about treating illness from watching the local doctor treat her aunt, and from studying medical texts she had found in the town library back in Boston. "I am not a trained nurse," Susan admitted to Dr. Morrison, "but I know about quarantine procedures, about keeping patients hydrated, about reducing fevers. I can help." Dr. Morrison, desperate for assistance, accepted her offer gratefully. Susan moved into a small room attached to the doctor's office and began working around the clock to care for the sick. She showed no fear of the contagious disease, only determination to help those who were suffering. James was terrified for her safety. Diphtheria killed even healthy adults, and Susan was exhausting herself with long hours and little sleep. But when he tried to convince her to step back and let others take the risk, she refused. "These people need help," she said firmly. "I have skills that can save lives. How could I live with myself if I stayed safe while children died?" Her courage and selflessness moved James deeply. He began helping in other ways, delivering supplies to the doctor's office, checking on quarantined families, doing whatever he could to support the medical effort. Sarah, meanwhile, organized the healthy children whose schools had been closed. She set up a temporary classroom in the church and kept the children occupied and educated while keeping them isolated from potential infection. Thomas Bennett worked alongside James, using his wagon to transport medicine and supplies between the doctor's office and the quarantined homesteads. The crisis brought the small community together, and it also revealed the true character of everyone involved. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, James found Susan sitting on the steps outside the doctor's office. She looked exhausted, her face drawn and pale. He sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance but offering his presence as comfort. "We lost the Johnson baby today," Susan said quietly, tears streaming down her face. She was only 6 months old. "Morrison said there was nothing more we could do, but I keep thinking there must have been something, some treatment we missed, some way we could have saved her." James wanted to reach out and hold her, to comfort her, but propriety held him back. "You have saved lives these past weeks, Susan. The Patterson children recovered because of your care. So did the Smith family. You cannot save everyone, no matter how hard you try." "I know that in my head," Susan replied, wiping her eyes, "but my heart feels differently." She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "How do you bear it, James? How do you face the harsh realities of frontier life without letting them crush your spirit?" "You do what you did today," James answered honestly. "You keep going. You grieve for what you lose, but you keep fighting for what you can save. And you remember that even small victories matter. That baby you lost today, her death is a tragedy. But the 5 other children who lived because of your care, they are miracles. Their families will be forever grateful to you." They sat together in silence as the sun set, finding comfort in each other's presence. In that moment, James knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to spend his life with this woman. Not because of letters or arrangements or obligations, but because Susan Crawford had shown him who she truly was. She was brave, compassionate, skilled, and strong. She was exactly the partner he needed for the challenges of frontier life, but he still said nothing. The community was in crisis, and personal matters had to wait. The diphtheria outbreak lasted another 2 weeks before finally subsiding. In total, the disease claimed 4 lives, all of them young children. The community mourned these losses deeply, but they also recognized that many more would have died without the tireless efforts of Dr. Morrison, Susan Crawford, and the volunteers who had assisted them. When the quarantine was finally lifted and life began to return to normal, the townspeople organized a gathering to thank those who had helped during the crisis. It was a somber celebration, marked by grief for those lost, but also by gratitude for those saved. Susan was praised repeatedly for her courage and skill, though she deflected the compliments with characteristic modesty. Sarah approached her sister that evening with tears in her eyes. "I was so frightened for you," she said, embracing Susan tightly. "Every day I worried that you would fall ill, that I might lose you again so soon after we found each other." "I am well, sister," Susan assured her, "tired, but well." Thomas Bennett stood nearby, and James noticed him watching Sarah with unmistakable affection. Over the past weeks, while James and Susan had been focused on the medical crisis, Thomas and Sarah had continued their courtship. Their relationship had developed more slowly than James and Susan's, but James could see genuine feeling growing between them. Later that evening, Thomas pulled James aside. "I need to speak with you about something important," he said seriously. "I know the timing may seem rushed, but recent events have reminded me that life is precious and uncertain. We should not waste time when we find something worth holding on to." James had a feeling he knew what Thomas was going to say, and his heart began to beat faster. I want to ask Sarah Crawford to marry me, Thomas continued. I have fallen in love with her, James. These past weeks, getting to know her, seeing her strength and grace during this crisis, watching her care for those children even while worried sick about her sister. She is everything I never thought I would find again after losing my wife. But I wanted to speak with you first, out of respect for the commitment you made to her through your letters. James felt a surge of relief so powerful that he almost laughed. Thomas, you have my blessing, my support, and my sincere hope that she says yes. Sarah is a wonderful woman, and you are a good man. I think you would make each other very happy. Thomas's face broke into a wide smile. Thank you, James. That means more to me than you know. He hesitated, then added, And what about you? What about Susan? Now it was James's turn to smile. I think you can probably guess the answer to that question. Well, I thought I saw the way things were developing between you two, Thomas said warmly. She is different from her sister, but equally remarkable in her own way. She is, James agreed, and if she will have me, I intend to ask her to be my wife. Not because of any letters or obligations or confusion, but because I love her for who she actually is. The two men shook hands, sealing an understanding that felt like the beginning of something good. The impossible situation that had seemed to have no solution was resolving itself in a way none of them could have predicted. 2 mail-order bride letters had brought 2 women west, and now those 2 women might both find happiness in this frontier community, living close enough to maintain the sisterly bond they had nearly lost. Thomas Bennett proposed to Sarah Crawford 3 days after the quarantine was lifted. He did so in the small garden behind the church, where wildflowers grew in cheerful defiance of the harsh Montana landscape. Sarah had been sitting on a wooden bench, reading a book of poetry that Thomas had given her the week before. He approached nervously, hat in hand, and asked if he might join her. Of course, Sarah said, moving over to make room on the bench. She could see the tension in his shoulders and wondered what was troubling him. Thomas sat down and was quiet for a long moment, as if gathering his courage. Finally, he turned to face her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her heart begin to race. "Miss Sarah," he began, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness, "I know we've only known each other for a short time. I know that you came to Montana expecting to marry a different man entirely. I know that this entire situation has been confusing and difficult for you." Sarah waited, hardly daring to breathe, sensing what was coming but not wanting to interrupt. "But these past weeks, getting to know you have awakened something in me that I thought had died with my wife," Thomas continued. "You have reminded me that life can hold joy again, that the future can be something to look forward to rather than just endure. I admire your intelligence, your kindness, your strength. I love the way you see beauty in small things, the way you care about education and learning, the way you remained graceful and supportive even while worried about your sister during the epidemic." He reached out and gently took her hand, and Sarah felt warmth spread through her entire body at his touch. "I am not a young man anymore, and I come with the weight of past grief," Thomas said. "But I promise you that if you accept me, I will spend every day trying to make you happy. I will cherish you, protect you, and support your dreams. Sarah Crawford, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. She had come west expecting one future and had found a completely different one. But this future, with this gentle, thoughtful man who loved books and poetry as much as she did, felt right in a way she could not fully explain. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Thomas Bennett, I will marry you." Thomas's face lit up with a smile so bright that it transformed him entirely. He looked years younger, unburdened by the grief that had weighed him down for so long. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, and Sarah felt her heart swell with happiness and hope. They sat together in the garden, making plans and talking about their future. Thomas described his ranch, explaining that his late wife had left her mark on the place with flower gardens and a small library she had collected. "I have not had the heart to change anything," he admitted, "but I think she would be happy to know that someone else who loves books and beauty will now live there and make it a home again." Sarah thought about this carefully. "I do not want to replace her memory," she said gently. "She was your first love, and she deserves to be remembered and honored." "You are not replacing her," Thomas assured her. "You are something new, something I never expected to find. There is room in a heart for more than one love, I am learning. The love I had for my wife will always be part of me, but it does not diminish what I feel for you. They are different loves, both precious, both real." His words touched Sarah deeply, and she knew in that moment that she had made the right choice. This was a man who understood loss and love, who would appreciate her for who she was, who would never take her presence for granted. When they returned to town to share their news, Susan was the first person Sarah sought out. She found her sister at Mrs. Chen's house, helping to prepare medicinal supplies to replenish what had been used during the epidemic. The moment Susan saw Sarah's glowing face, she knew what had happened. "He asked you," Susan said, not as a question, but as a statement. "He did," Sarah confirmed, unable to stop smiling. "And I said yes." The sisters embraced tightly, both crying now, both overwhelmed by emotion. They had been through so much together and apart, had faced separation and hardship and uncertainty. Now they were both finding happiness in this unexpected place, and they would not have to be separated again. "Are you truly happy?" Susan asked, pulling back to look at her sister's face. "You are not just accepting him because you feel you have no other choice?" "I am truly happy," Sarah assured her. "Thomas is a good man, Susan. He is kind and thoughtful, and he loves the same things I love. When I am with him, I feel like I can be myself completely. I think we will have a good life together." Susan hugged her sister again, relief evident in her face. "I am so glad. I have been worried about what would happen, how this would all work out, but now at least one of us has found a path forward." "And what about you?" Sarah asked gently. "What about you and Mr. McAllister?" Susan's cheeks colored, but she smiled. "I do not know yet. We have not spoken of such things. But I confess, sister, that I have developed feelings for him. These past weeks working together during the crisis, I have seen what kind of man he is. He is strong but gentle, practical but with a good heart. I find myself hoping that perhaps there might be a future for us as well." As if summoned by their conversation, James appeared at Mrs. Chen's door moments later. He had heard about the engagement from Thomas and wanted to offer his congratulations to Sarah. But when he saw both sisters together, he asked if he might speak with Susan privately. Sarah and Mrs. Chen tactfully excused themselves, leaving James and Susan alone in the small sitting room. James seemed nervous, more nervous than Susan had ever seen him. He paced back and forth a few times before finally stopping in front of her. "Susan," he began, then stopped and started again. "Miss Susan? Miss Crawford?" "Susan." He shook his head at his own awkwardness. "I apologize. I am not good with words the way Thomas is. I am a simple man, better with actions than speeches." Susan found his nervousness endearing. "Just speak from your heart, James. That is all I need to hear." James took a deep breath. "I brought you here under false pretenses, though neither of us knew it at the time. I thought I was corresponding with one woman, but I was actually getting to know two. When you both stepped off that wagon, I was completely lost. I did not know what to do or how to make things right." He moved closer to her, his eyes earnest and sincere. "But these past weeks, spending time with you, seeing you work so tirelessly to help others during the epidemic, watching you turn my rough cabin into a home even in small ways during your visits, I have come to know the real you. Not the woman from the letters, but the actual Susan Crawford who stands before me, and I have fallen in love with that woman." Susan's breath caught in her throat. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must surely be able to hear it. "I know I am not the most educated man," James continued. "I cannot quote poetry like Thomas can. I cannot offer you fancy things or an easy life. Frontier ranching is hard work, and there will be difficult times ahead. But I can promise you loyalty, respect, and a love that is based on who you truly are, not on words written in letters. Susan Crawford, would you consider becoming my wife?" Susan felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling through them. "James McAllister, I came to Montana expecting to marry a man I had never met, based on letters and hope and desperation. I thought I understood what I was agreeing to, but you are so much more than those letters suggested. You are kind and brave and good. You work hard, but you also care deeply about people. You showed compassion to both Sarah and me when you could have simply sent us away. Yes, I will marry you. Yes, with all my heart." James's face broke into a grin so wide that Susan could not help but laugh. He took her hands in his, and the warmth of his touch sent shivers through her entire body. "You have made me the happiest man in Montana," he said softly. "I promise I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this decision." The news of the double engagement spread through the community like wildfire. People who had been gossiping about the scandal of the twin mail-order brides now spoke with delight about the romantic resolution to the situation. Mrs. Patterson at the general store declared it the most romantic story she had ever heard. The cowboys who had witnessed the initial confusion in the street now raised their glasses in the saloon, toasting the happiness of all four people involved. Mrs. Chen, when she heard the news, simply nodded with satisfaction. "I told you," she said to James. Problems that seem impossible often solve themselves if you give them time and trust in people's goodness. The community decided to hold a double wedding in the spring, giving both couples time to prepare properly and allowing the harsh winter to pass before beginning their new lives together. Thomas's ranch house needed some repairs and updates to make it ready for Sarah. James's cabin required expansion to accommodate a wife. There were supplies to gather, arrangements to make, and countless details to manage. During those winter months, the four of them spent considerable time together, often gathering at Mrs. Chen's house for meals and conversation. The twins delighted in planning their weddings together, sharing the joy that each had found in such unexpected ways. James and Thomas became close friends, bonding over their shared experiences and their gratitude for the remarkable women who had agreed to marry them. Sarah began preparing to open a small school in the area. Several families had approached her during the epidemic, asking if she would be willing to teach their children. She was thrilled at the prospect of finally realizing her dream of being a teacher. Thomas supported her ambitions fully, even helping her plan how to convert one of his unused outbuildings into a proper schoolhouse. Susan, meanwhile, worked with James to expand his cabin and make it more suitable for family life. She drew detailed plans for additions they would build in the spring. She organized his chaotic supply system and taught him more efficient ways of managing his household. She also worked with Dr. Morrison occasionally, having discovered during the epidemic that she had both talent and passion for medical work. The old doctor, recognizing her skills, encouraged her to continue learning and helping him with patients when she could. Winter on the Montana frontier was harsh, but the four of them weathered it with hope warming their hearts. They shared meals, told stories, played cards, and built friendships that would sustain them through all the challenges ahead. The twins, who had been forcibly separated for 2 years, now lived in the same small town, able to see each other almost daily. Their bond, which had been tested by distance and their aunt's cruelty, grew stronger than ever. When spring finally arrived, painting the prairie with wildflowers and bringing warmth back to the frozen land, the entire community came together for the double wedding. It was held in the church, decorated with wildflowers that Sarah and Susan had gathered together. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. Thomas and Sarah exchanged vows first, their voices steady and sure. Then James and Susan stood before the minister, promising to love and cherish each other through all of life's trials and joys. There was not a dry eye in the church. Even the roughest cowboys found themselves wiping away tears. Mrs. Chen smiled with satisfaction, knowing that her wisdom and patience had helped guide these four people to happiness. The minister spoke about the mysterious ways of providence, about how sometimes our plans go astray but lead us exactly where we need to be. After the ceremony, the community held a celebration that lasted well into the evening. There was food, music, dancing, and laughter. Children ran around playing games while adults shared stories and toasted the new couples. It was a rare moment of pure joy in the often difficult life of the frontier, and everyone wanted to savor it. As the sun set on their wedding day, James and Susan stood together outside his cabin, now their cabin, watching the sky paint itself in brilliant colors. James wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders, and Susan leaned against him, feeling completely at peace. "Did you ever imagine things would turn out this way?" James asked softly. Susan thought about the question carefully. "When I wrote that first letter to the matrimonial agency, I was desperate and frightened. I imagined escaping my aunt's house, finding security and perhaps companionship. But this happiness, this love, having my sister nearby, finding work I am passionate about, becoming part of a community, no, I never imagined anything this good." Neither did I," James admitted. "I thought I was simply solving a practical problem, finding a wife to share the work and ease the loneliness. I never expected to find a true partner, someone I admire and respect as much as I love." 5 miles away, Thomas and Sarah stood in the garden behind their house, the same garden where he had proposed months earlier. Sarah held a book of poetry, and Thomas had his arm around her waist. They watched the same sunset, marveling at the same beauty. Grateful for the same unexpected blessings. "Read to me," Thomas requested, and Sarah opened the book to one of her favorite poems. Her voice carried softly on the evening breeze as she read words about love and hope and new beginnings. The years that followed brought both challenges and triumphs to both couples. There were harsh winters that tested their endurance and droughts that threatened their livelihoods. There were illnesses and losses, disappointments and fears. But there were also births of children who grew up together, playing between the two homesteads. There were harvest celebrations and holidays spent as an extended family. There were quiet evenings of reading and conversation, hard days of shared labor, and countless moments of simple contentment. Sarah's school flourished, educating children from families scattered across the territory. She became known as an excellent teacher, patient, and inspiring. Susan continued to work with Dr. Morrison and eventually became the community's unofficial nurse, respected for her medical knowledge and compassionate care. The two sisters remained extraordinarily close, supporting each other through childbirth and child-rearing, illness and hardship. James and Thomas became more than neighbors and more than friends. They became brothers in all but blood, their families so intertwined that the children barely distinguished between the two households. When one family faced difficulty, the other was there to help without question or hesitation. Years later, when the children were old enough to ask questions, they wanted to know the story of how their mothers had come to Montana, how the families had come together. The four adults would exchange glances, sharing smiles that held decades of shared history, and they would tell the story of the cowboy who had waited for a bride by mail order, only to have identical twins step off the wagon. They told it honestly, including the confusion and fear and uncertainty of those early days. But they also told of the unexpected blessings that had come from that confusion, the way lives had intertwined in patterns none of them could have predicted or planned. Sometimes Susan would tell the children, "The best things in life are the ones we never saw coming. We plan and hope and work towards certain goals, but life has its own ideas about what we need and where we belong. The key," Sarah would add, "is to remain open to possibilities, to trust in goodness, and to have courage when faced with the unexpected." The children would listen wide-eyed to this tale that sounded like something from a storybook but was actually the true story of their own families. And as they grew older, they carried forward the lessons their parents had learned, that love can be found in unexpected places, that family is not always defined by blood alone, that challenges can transform into blessings, and that sometimes the most confusing beginnings lead to the happiest endings.